So I'm going to introduce all of you because I have your bios, and then we'll get started. We're recording now, and then we're going to go on Facebook. All right. So our first panelist is Elexio Baillou. And Elexio is an insightful 21st century author, international speaker, and spiritual leader who specializes in the study of addressing issues relevant to the transformation of society. He is respected for his insight, humor, challenging perspectives, and received as a voice of counsel to ministry leaders in the Bahamas, and other nations. He has given his life to empowerment of the present and future ministry leaders, employing his background in business, experience preaching the gospel, research into a plurality of issues related to scripture, gender, and sexuality, and a passion for mankind to offer keen insights into the way forward for a transformed church that models the nature and power of Jesus Christ in the present age. So can we all welcome Elexio as a panelist? Say hello, Elexio, to everyone out there.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Latino, and to the rest of the community for the opportunity to be here. This is a great moment, and I'm absolutely grateful and humbled for the privilege that's been extended to me.
All right, our second panelist is Jonathan Wesley, who is a multi-talented queer clergyman who loves to transform lives one experience at a time. He was born in Newark, New Jersey, and raised in Irvington, New Jersey. He holds a bachelor's degree in sociology, a master's in higher education administration, and a master's in religion and public life graduate certificates in leadership and pastoral care, counseling, and is currently a candidate for a PhD in educational policy studies. Jonathan currently serves as an Associate Dean of Liberal Arts, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. In addition to serving the Academy and the community, he is also an ordained elder and serves as the Director of Membership Services and Ministerial Training at the Vision of Cathedral, Atlanta. Also, Jonathan has published the best-selling book entitled God Said Differently, Silencing the Unauthorized Voices and Living Your Authentic Life, which is available on all ebook sites as well as Amazon. Above all, Jonathan is a servant leader by theory as well as practice. He believes the best way to lead people is by serving along with them and not from a dictatorship. He made a commitment to his mother, who passed 2 days before his 25th birthday, that he would continue to make her happy and show society that greatness can come from a single parent, first generation environment. He lives by the mantra, if I can help somebody as I pass along the way, then my living will not be in vain. Can we just welcome Jonathan Wesley, and can you say hi to everyone who's watching, Jonathan?
Hey, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to the conversation with this other great community. So, hey.
All right, and our third panelist is none other than Pastor Matthew Sweeting. Matthew is a graduate of Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, Illinois, where he pursued his degree in pastoral studies. He has been involved in pastoral ministry at the New Providence Community Church, yes, over the past 28 years, and has served as senior pastor for the past decade. He was born and raised in the Bahamas, but pursued his studies and served in a number of churches and ministries around the US. He has developed a teaching ministry over the past 2 decades and loves to communicate the truths of God's words to this generation. He has a deep passion for the local church, and in particular, the spiritual health of his congregants as they live out their faith in practical, relevant ways. He and his wife, Allison, have been married for over 21 years, and they are the proud parents of two sons, Adam and Michael. All right, can we all welcome Pastor Matthew Sweeting? And can you just say hi to everyone who's watching, Pastor Matthew?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the honor to be here. As Elexio and Jonathan have already reiterated, just a real pleasure to join your beautiful family, and looking forward to some engaging dialogue this morning as we continue to learn from one another. So thank you so much for having me.
All right. So right at this moment, what I'm going to ask everyone to do, if you're on social media, I want you to share this, right? Because this is we've reached out and we've been instrumental in we've reached out to community leaders, and we're going to continue to do that. But we want to engage everyone. So I'm going to ask you to share, on all social media platforms at this time. Just take 1 minute to do that right now if you're in the room, because we want people to hear this. We want people to be engaged with it, right? So make sure to do that. Take a few seconds out so that we could do that. Then I'll prepare the because I have a video that I want to show, and I think that this will set the ground. Can you make me a host, please? I want to set. I think that this video will set the ground for where we're going in this conversation. Okay. Yes. Okay. And we should be ready to go. All right. So I'm sharing this particular video, and I want us to listen in, and then we'll begin the conversation here. All right.
Some of you are jealous. Some of you are nasty minded. Some of you, even in the midst of COVID-19, the only thing you got to do is pay attention to what Johnson preaching. Glory to God. If I rebuke the singing bishop, so what? He need to stop acting like a woman. Glory to God. Hallelujah. Somebody got to tell him. Ain't nobody pulling nobody down. If it's anything, I trying to lift him up. I trying to tell him get delivered. His blood is not going to be on my hand. His salvation is not going to be on my hand. You ain't going to be around here acting effeminate and winding up in God church like a woman whining and whining and whining. You know, man's supposed to whine. I rebuke that nasty spirit. That is the spirit of deception. Glory to God. Act like a man. Walk like a man. Talk like a man. Singing bishop. Walk like a man. Talk like a man. God didn't create you to be no woman. You all can get all the man in the world.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and comments. I wanted to start there because this happened a few months ago, and just for some context for Jonathan, right? That's Apostle Julian Johnson, who's a pastor in the Bahamas, and he was rebuking another sure he was rebuking another pastor for acting effeminate in church. And he was saying that, as you heard in the statement, God didn't create you to be a woman, walk like a man, talk like a man, act like a man. And I thought that that's a very great way to start this interrogation. And I'll allow Elexio to start us off with his thoughts from that perspective.
All right. Thank you for letting me get this off my chest because I was writing notes. The first thing that comes to my mind is that when I see that video, the thing that automatically I began to reflect on is that more often than not, and this is an unfortunate fact, the truth remains that the church is more often a reflection of the prejudices and the homophobia present in society as opposed to the nature of Jesus Christ. And this is further empowered and entrenched due to the fact that if it is that you've ever studied church history, and if it is that you understand how it is that we tend to view scripture and how it is that essentially we tend to abuse passages of scripture and take it out of complete context, that it allows us to weaponize the Bible and to weaponize theology and to weaponize our faith and whatever to essentially condemn and mistreat and malign anybody or any issue that we tend to have a negative focus on. But to be quite honest, if it is that you look at scripture, unfortunately, even at a cursory glance, at first level, just by looking at it, it seems as if the Bible gives validation for that type of behavior. I mean, how many of us heard the fact that Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed wrongly? We were taught wrongly because of the fact that it was because of the sin of homosexuality, even though there is no understanding of sexual orientation or anything along those lines within the time and the consciousness of those that gave the scriptures and whatnot. And so when I see a video for that, I am I'm not surprised at that sentiment. I think it's simply the overflow of the general consciousness, unfortunately, of Bahamian and Caribbean culture. And what it is that we see happening there, unfortunately, it has a way of showing up within the church community, and they tend to utilize spirituality, theology to support and endorse the same beliefs that unfortunately people in general tend to be held to within a not so much progressive type of climate here in the Bahamas. You're on mute.
Pastor Matthew, would you like to jump in here? What are your thoughts? Because I know that you would, you're a member, or you've been around the Christian council circles, and you've been a pastor for a very long time. Like, knowing some of these people, like, what are your thoughts on that? The video.
Yeah, I don't actually spend too much time with the Christian Council. We've really taken the last 29 years of just trying to build relationships. First of all, let me just back up. That type of video, I mean, it's just everywhere. You see it all over social media. And the downside of social media is that people can put a message out there, and it's not really being shaped by other perspectives. Someone has a camera, they have a phone, they have a microphone, they put it out there. And, there's a lot of talk by social scientists these days about the damaging results of social media, where there's no accountability, and we're probably living out what Andy Warhol predicted many years ago. He said everyone would get their 20 seconds of fame because the technology has allowed that, and when I see things like that, I often view them as if they're happening in a vacuum. And I would not say, I don't know this individual. I've never even heard of him or met him, Dr. Johnson, but I would say that, sometimes those videos seem to have a certain power to them, where if people are watching them and they're listening to this person for the first time, I often wonder if what they're assuming is that particular point of view representative of the greater whole. And it has not been my experience that is the case. Although those videos can have an inflammatory nature, and, they do leave woundedness and brokenness in their wake. It's unfortunate that the technology allows people to say that, but I would say it's in the absence of a greater dialogue that's actually taking place. And there's more we could talk about that later today, but to me, that happens a lot. I often do a lot of study around the world, what's happening globally. There's over 20,000 denominations in the church today. That's a lot of different groups, all of whom have not really spent a lot of time getting to know each other, even getting to like each other, much less to dialogue together. When any one of those voices uses platforms that are accessible to all and puts it out there, it kind of flattens the conversation before it even gets started, because it's not really a dialogue. It's just someone, and who knows how long that video is going to circulate before either someone takes it down or they stop listening, or maybe they don't stop listening. I don't know. But to me, it's not really what many of us in the church are trying to do as we try to create opportunities like today for engagement, for listening, for learning, and even for sometimes what we call unlearning, taking what we've been hearing for years and saying, can you tell me your story? Can you tell me your point of view? So that's the first thing I would say about that today.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to put a pin there because you said something I want to come back to, but I'll give a chance to Jonathan to respond to what he thought about that. I'm seeing that video and being given the context from an outside perspective.
Yeah, so, that video, the language behind the video and the spirit of hate, to see, it was addressing spirits, right? The spirit of hate and dogma is not unfamiliar, to me being here in the United States. I have heard that same prayer prayed over me as well. So the connection from a cultural perspective was just like, wow, but the difference in this day and age for me is that I'm free enough to understand that I don't have a spirit of femininity or a spirit of queerness. This is who God created me to be in a very unique and divine way. And I love and I embrace all of it. So unfortunately, though, to that point, there are others who hear that dogma and live life under the oppression and thinking that God has created us in error and does not love us. And thus, when he uses the language about blood being on hands, I often ask other clergy and other believers, Christian believers more specifically, if a person who hears that dogmatic rhetoric that comes from our mouth, if they go and commit suicide, whose blood? Who's responsible for that bloodshed? We can't say that it was God. So normally when I pose those types of questions back, it may cause some to kind of come down some, but unfortunately, again, the dogma behind it is very discouraging. But oftentimes, any type of hate speech also gets a raise out of people, right? So folks who believe that, especially from a church perspective, fund those types of institutions. So oftentimes when clergy say something contrary to that, their tithes and offerings or whatever funding decreases. So I can also understand it from that perspective too, right? Individuals, to Pastor's point, they make these statements, they have a camera and a microphone, and I was like, well, who else can I get to join in on my bandwagon? Instead of really critically thinking about, is this the agenda of the God of the person that they are claiming to believe in, if that makes sense. And I'll pause there.
Great. Pastor Matthew, you talked about something that you talked about flattening the conversation and I guess not getting the conversation started. It's a way to destroy the conversation or prevent barriers to the conversation or put up barriers to the conversation before it even gets going, right? So the question then becomes, why in the Bahamas? Because I attempted to reach out and attempted to have conversations with engage a couple of Bahamian pastors. And I was met with, either, just a blank, I can't, or, I don't think that I'm ready to have that conversation right now. Why are Bahamian pastors unwilling to have this conversation? In particular, why is the Christian Council, who Alexis has said, she showed me the emails, they've been sent, the phone calls that have been mentioned, I guess, to this kind of organization that supposedly it stands up, or it appears in the public forum as the leading voice for all. It gives that appearance. I'm not saying it's true, but it gives that appearance that it's speaking for all denominations when it makes these kinds of claims. Why is it that church leaders and the Christian Council not willing to engage in conversations like this, but you have been willing to?
Well, I think if you were to back the conversation up, and I think you have to look at by the way, that's a very good question. But I think whenever you're having these kind of conversations, you have to look at context, because every culture has to think about why sometimes they're willing to engage, sometimes they're willing to not engage. And in our culture, it's been a long time now where we have seen many examples in our culture where Bahamians build with these meta conversations around these big issues without actually building relationship with one another. And I think you could argue reasonably so that wherever around the world people are coming together in their differences and they're looking for moments of solidarity, you can't really do that if you let the issue itself or any type of issue drive the conversation. You always have to build this around proximity. You have to build this around learning, around what sociologists call generative listening, which is, I'm not going to answer your question before you ask it because I have the answer. I need to listen to you. I need to hear what you have to say. So we're going to build our relationship around learning, around generative listening, and mostly around relationship. In the first century, they used to call this process midrash, where the rabbis would sit down and they would open a scroll, these ancient scrolls. And what I found fascinating about that, and that was 2,000 years ago that they were doing this. But whenever they would read the scroll, they would roll it up, put it back in a safe place. And then the rabbi would turn to this very mixed group of people He would say, well, what do you think it means? So instead of having one person saying, well, here's the only way to read this, here's the only way to talk about it, in the first century, we're seeing early evidences of people sitting down, and women and men were actually allowed to actually throw in and throw down. And I think a lot of that has been lost. If you look at some of the greatest moments in Bahamian history, those moments, I would argue, have come around solidarity, whether it was majority rule or independence or even suffrage movements. And I don't think you can have these kind of conversations, even in our day and time, unless people are willing to sit down and to say, you know what, we're going to have to share life together. This is not a debate. This is about listening. They say the best communication happens when you drop your guard, which means someone's not coming at you. It's not a combative relationship. It's a listening relationship. And I think in our country, we have to create these environments where the objective is to grow and know each other just as much as it is to learn from each other. And you can't have one without the other. And so I think the institutions around us aren't really going about that in a way where their relationship, like respecting each other, learning from each other, is just as high on the list as is, well, you need to hear what I have to say. And sexuality is such a difficult conversation because you can't talk about that without learning to care for the person you're talking with. And so, yes, we don't like the outcomes we're seeing where people aren't talking at all, or they're not creating space for this kind of dialogue to happen. But I think that's because, again, we just haven't taken the time to build relationship.
Can I slip in, Latino?
Go ahead. I was
Okay,
going to you.
Okay, well, I think there's several things that we tend not to consider whenever we talk about the church and engaging the LGBT community. And the first thing I would say is this: it is not the church and the LGBT community, but many times the LGBT community is a subsect of the church. I think that is one of the first issues. And so that is, first of all, a reality many church leaders aren't able to address individually within their own selves, as well as within their broader community. So if you cannot address it within the context of your own community, you are definitely not going to want to hold onto it and deal with it within the wider perspective. Secondly, you have to understand that many of our leaders, whether they say it or not, there is a lot of fear. There is deep LGBT community. There's a reason the term homophobia, phobia meaning phobos, fear, that there is a deeply ingrained fear of people who are queer, whether it is that they are known or, well, pretty much if it is that you're out. If it is, a lot of times within church culture, if it is that you're on the DL, we could use you and make use of you, however that dynamic tends to work, then it is that you're fine. Once it is that you have not said that you no longer have a struggle, but that there's an aspect of your identity that you have embraced. So you're dealing with fear, as well as you have to understand that in general, many Christian leaders, and I'm not saying this from a point of hatred, but in a diagnostic of given a diagnosis to help us to understand certain things, that what we're also dealing with is the fact that they think it is a non-issue. If it is that you feel as the scripture is completely clear on this topic, on this subject matter, then you are not going to want to address it. You're not going to feel the need to engage people who have a very different perspective from you, because you figure that you're right. And it's not just as it pertains to the queer community, but it's also as it pertains to women in general. If it is that you believe that what is it you thought and how it is you saw scripture is the final analysis, you're not going to want to embrace these issues on a deeper level. And the truth remains that one of the reasons I love Pastor Matthew and NPCC is because they built outside of that context, so they're more capable of holding these type of engagements or whatnot. But that is unfortunately not how many of our churches are built and developed. As well as consider the fact that ignorance is still the thing that we see a lot of times coming across the pulpit. And as I said earlier, what you see occurring is that usually what you see within the local assembly is unfortunately a reflection of what's going on in the wider community. And so some of the same prejudices and the same issues. And so the Christian Council is not going to want to take this type of stuff on, because at the end of the day, to be Christ-like, to engage in this way also means dealing with suffering. that the Christian walk, that the sincere Christian walk of a believer, of walking in truth and engaging and being Christ-like, a lot of times means that you're going to have to deal with the persecution of the culture as well as the persecution of the religious and those who don't want and who are oppressive and resistant to change. And so what happens is that the reason they have an issue with these type of conversations because a lot of times in general churches are built and communities are developed in such a way that they're not given towards suffering for any type of cause rather than their own prosperity and simply trying to do all that they can do to behave and get to heaven. And so so those are the issues. So deeper social engagement is not an issue. We just pray, we rebuke the devil, and we go about our merry way.
If I can connect,
go ahead, go ahead. Go ahead.
You know, to these points that have been lifted, and I think it is great to be able to have the conversation as the one step, but the connected aspect to that, kind of as Elexio was sharing, it's difficult when trying to engage in a conversation when at the end of it still the statement is made, I love you, but I hate your sin. Right? So there's this constant idea that, you know, oh, I love you as a person, but your queerness is just wrong and I just can't get with it. I can't understand it. As a matter of fact, I won't understand it and then use, you know, religious doctrine to state why. Is really, really troubling, is contradictory in a lot of ways. And from a Black perspective, I'm in the thick of writing my comprehensive exams in my PhD program. So Higginbotham talks about the politics of respectability. And oftentimes as it relates to queerness and the intersections of race and sexuality and gender, queerness is deemed, especially from a Black perspective, to be an embarrassment to the race itself because it does not promote racial uplift, especially in times where we're dealing with so much racist behavior and practices. But I'm connecting that to say that beyond the conversation, it will really take you know, individuals who are spewing this type of rhetoric, I saw it in the chat, to change the posture in order to hear and to receive in order to be transformed. We're not made to just, you know, transform just because somebody said it, but transformation is a posture. And if we're not willing to hear and to receive and to think differently and to think critically and to think higher, you know, than what we are often, you know, just reading that's in Black and red text, then we miss out on the experience, to your point, about building these relationships. Because the relationship will never be fully authentic if at the end of it, it says, oh, I love you, but I hate your sin. Because what they deem to be sinful is still very much part of our identities. They are part of who we are. So to say, well, I love you, but hate all of this other stuff about you, which then predicates other types of oppression. Whereas, as Elexio mentioned, you know, if you can keep it on the DL, we won't ever have any problems. But the moment that one talks and really testifies and tells their truth, it causes a severance, it causes an ostracization, it causes a break in relationships, which is often unfortunate and very, very damaging. So then the question becomes, how do we then, you know, either try to repair that, or how do queer people find institutions that are progressive enough in their theology and in their practicality to say, come on, come all, we accept you, we believe in you, and we love you, and we don't deem you as being less than a child of God or not a child of God at all, simply because of the intersecting identities of your gender, race, and your sexuality, right? So those challenges, you know, they make it really difficult, right, to build and be in community with others who really don't want to be in community with us, outside of the idea that, oh, well, God said I gotta love you, so let me just do it. Because then it's made to seem like it's not authentic, because then in that respect, God is just telling you to do it. You really don't have any desire to do it. So just to please God, I'm just going to do this for the sake of it and pray that I make it in whatever ways that's supposed to manifest itself, right? And I know I said a lot, but I'm going to pause there.
No, I think you bring up some great points and you're really getting the ball going. So yes, you talk about two things, right? that whole but. So I love you, but, right? And in English, you understand that whatever comes after, whatever came before the but is negated by the next preceding lines, right? Whatever's going to come out of your mouth, I love you, but means that this is really what I want to say. I just preface that to soften the blow. And that's something that you have, like, we have to understand that, right? In that context. And then you talk about respectability politics, which is something that I've underscored from my life. I said, I'm not playing that game. I'm not even pandering to that. No. So the minute I walk in and you want to, oh, you have to carry yourself in this, we call it professional way, or the way that some people just they don't look the part, they don't act the part. All of these things kind of culminate into this very difficult kind of conversation or barrier to having these difficult conversations. As well as I wanted to introduce the term cognitive dissonance. The fact that when they're presented with two conflicting ideas, not just the church, but human beings in general have a very difficult time resolving that internal conflict. And what they do is they rationalize, as you said, that in order for me to get to heaven, that I just need to love you enough so that I could just please God and then get to where I need to go. And I think that leads us like into this kind of where I'm going to take the conversation. Is there a space in particular? Well, I know that you guys are doing it in Atlanta, right? And we're going to come to you, right? You're doing it, right?
Can I slip in one?
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Stick a pin with that. You all keep throwing around this term, love. Just recently, I did a series of posts, and I said the church hates the queer community, and I put a disclaimer, and I said the reason I said the church hates the queer community is because a lot of times, what we call love is really hatred. And I think part of the issue, what has to be addressed at the foundation, at a fundamental level, is this understanding of that what we call is the fact that what we call love many times is almost perverse. It's a 180-degree turn, as if what I call, because I love you, I cannot endorse you engaging in behaviors that I believe to be destructive. And so this is not an endorsement of a lot of things that I may have heard from Christian leaders, but what I find out is that because they're so beheld to certain ideas and beliefs, they think that the posture of love, well, the posture of love requires behaving in a certain fashion that at the end of the day, they think that it's better that you be broken and maybe crippled or never experiencing affection or any of those type of dynamics that they themselves may seemingly tend to enjoy freely, because they think that it is better for you. And I've heard church leaders tell me this. I heard a senior leader be having a discussion, and he said he believes that queer people are called to be eunuchs for the sake of the gospel. That is that is part of the ideology and the philosophy and the perspectives that is given, and that the reward of queer people is the Lord. And so that's what Jesus is speaking to. So there is these series of ideas that show up in practices, from reparative therapy to your deliverance to church discipline, things along these lines, because these are held to be expressions of affection and expressions of sincere concern. And so, but it was unheld by ignorance, as well as the fact that, at the end of the day, to embrace these issues, even as we talk about engaging in a relationship, requires, number one, an openness to dealing with someone as they say that they are. And we cannot say that this is who it is that you are, because we think that who you are, as what you hold to homosexuality or being transgender, intersex, whatever, is not a verb. It's a noun. It's a part of who it is that you are. But we want to deal with a particular set of actions. That's why they call it a lifestyle. That's how it becomes a series of practices. And so I think it comes back down at the end of the day to having a clear understanding of what it truly means to be loving in terms of the nature of Christ. And I think that is a struggle that many Christ followers struggle with.
Well, I think it's a struggle. Dana, you can let us know if you want to come back to it. You want to just keep asking questions?
No, go ahead. No, go ahead, and then.
I don't want to disrupt your flow there.
No, go ahead. You're flowing, and then we have an audience member who has a question. So after you speak, I'll get the question, and then we'll continue from there. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you to Jonathan and Elexio for your observations and your insights, by the way. Yeah, I mean, I have a slightly different perspective on a lot of these things because when you work in the church, I've been in the church for 29 years, but I've been bivocational for 29 years. I've always worked multiple careers at the same time. This is definitely the hardest thing I've ever had to do with my life, is to work in a community of faith. And some of what I hear that we are bringing to light today, it's inherently a problem for most religions. It really is. I know we're talking about the Christian Council today because we're Bahamians and we live in the Bahamas, but I see the same struggles in many religions because a lot of what we're talking about today, I would actually call them outcomes. People often do things and say things and think things, but they don't know how they got there. And to me, the way that people do the things that Elexio is describing to us today, I would call that an outcome because if you back that up, what's really behind that is a larger conversation. And that conversation is who's in and who's out. That's always been the fundamental insecurity of most religions. And people have never been adept having that type of discernment where they know how to relate to someone who doesn't think about it or talk about it or even feel about it the same way. So by the time the sexuality conversation gets put on the table, they haven't resolved that larger issue for them, which is who's in and who's out. Because you can't talk about sexuality without actually giving great thought, I mean, years and years of reflection to how do you really know where to draw the line for people. And this has always been the fundamental struggle of any type of institution, not just religion. Many institutions struggle with this. It's what sociologists call differentiation, which means the human brain does not readily understand, what it hasn't experienced. And most people, they fall back in a default kind of way on their own frame of reference, which is all that they've heard and all that they've seen. And it doesn't take into account what they haven't understood, and it creates a lot of trouble because if you don't really have the ability to critique your viewpoint, one of my favorite writers, he's a Franciscan monk in New Mexico. He's been writing for the last 4 to 5 decades on why we fight about our differences. He's been giving us a language for our differences. His name is Richard Rohr. He always says that every viewpoint is a view from a point. Every viewpoint is a view from a point. No one teaches you what to do with your point of view. You just only know to say, well, this is what I believe, or this is what I think. You don't know how to critique it. You haven't been taught how to critique it. You don't know when unlearning needs to take place. And so by the time you talk about sexuality or anything else where there's just a plethora of views coming together at these points of convergence, you haven't laid the groundwork, to be able to broach that. It's a very complex conversation because then you have to talk about identity. And that's what Elexio is talking about, as well as John. You cannot talk about sexuality if you haven't been taught in a broad way to talk about identity, and it gets most people into a lot of trouble because, the Buddhists have language for this. And sometimes Jesus used to call this kind of language wineskin thinking, but it's what the Buddhists call dual versus non-dual thinking. And if you were trained in the West, most of us, because we're island people, we grew up in a very Western mindset. We were trained to think in a very dual way, which is what we call it binary thinking, very black and white. It's either or right or wrong. We don't have this Eastern ability or sensibility to have what we call non-dual thinking. And if you've grown up, whether it's in your family or in your schools or in your churches, your communities where everything's very binary, your brain can't even entertain a larger conversation. Now, in the world of spirituality, unless your faith comes alongside of your subconscious is the only gift you've been given by God. If you look at all spirituality, where you can embrace the mystery of something, you cannot put mystery in categories of either or. Mystery is in the world of gray. It's where things spill over and there's multiple colors and textures and perspectives and opinions. And our subconscious is the only thing that guides our faith and our other sensibilities into these places of gray. And if you try to take something that has mystery attached, because to me, identity is mystery. You wouldn't have colonialism were it not for the fact that one culture looks down on another culture. You wouldn't have sexism or misogynistic thinking if people don't say, well, the reason I don't embrace your point of view is I haven't been raised to think about your point of view. And so non-dual thinking takes years to develop in most people, where you no longer say that, this marker looks like this. You're starting to take the time to say, well, it could look like this, or it could look like this, or it could look like this. And you go through a process where you're weighing it, based upon different points of view through history, dialogue, culture, language, and so on. And people haven't been prepared to think like that. And so you'll always see the outcome. Again, I think we're talking about outcomes today, what they say, what they think, how they treat you, how they feel, what they really believe has all come from this thinking where it could only be this option or that option. So if they're right, you're wrong. And Jesus, the language that Jesus gave us for this, and this was very dangerous language for the first century. He said, if you're getting a new way of thinking about something, you have to make sure that your new container can take the new ideas. Otherwise, it will destroy the container. And in the ancient church, in the ancient world, rather, they didn't have the technology of glass. So they put all their best booze in animal skins. But if you left that wine in there too long, the wine would ferment, and then it would literally tear the seams from the inside out. And Jesus would use that as a metaphor and say, whenever you have new ways of thinking about something, you cannot put that in the container of your parents or your grandparents or their parents, or sometimes even the way your culture has thought about it for hundreds of years. You might need a new container. And when people don't think of thinking that way, where you can actually take an entirely different way of thinking about it, then no, the outcomes won't change at all, because they're going to always come back to what they heard that people have saying from 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And so when I talked earlier today about having relationships with people, I'm not talking about relationships in and of themselves. I'm talking about people that you surround yourself with to say, well, you know what, have you ever thought about it this way? Because in this culture, this is how they have thought about it. And it may not line up with Bahamian thinking or North American thinking, and denominations who are willing to go into this deep water together, they don't really need to put the period at the end of the sentence. They put 3 dots, like to be continued. We need to keep talking about this. We need to keep learning together. We need to keep unlearning together. And the modern word for this is liminality. And the ancient word for it is heretic. In the ancient world, if you came to a new way of thinking about something, their word for that was heretic. Now, even though that's been used in a very negative, unfortunate manner, the literal definition of heresy is very good. It means that you've seen too much, you know too much, you've come too far. You cannot go back to thinking about something the way you used to. So you could be a happy heretic. And Jesus says, well, that's the equivalent of changing your skin. This new idea won't fit into an old way of thinking about the idea, whether it's identity or sexuality or spirituality or culture, whatever. And so we need to form relationships where people are bringing a different point of view, because you've been taught your entire life you can only talk about it this way. And someone says, well, we've only been taught to look at it this way, and so on and so forth. And the conversation grows when the starting point is that not there's only 2 ways, whether it's black or white, right or wrong, whatever. The starting point has to be, well, other angles, perspectives. And we call this perspectival truth, the way that you hold a diamond in your hand. And every time you turn the diamond, you see a different facet of it. We say truth becomes perspectival because it has to be shaped by other voices. And if you don't build relationships and build environments around those types of learning and approaches, then you will always have the predictable outcome of, I said this and you said that, and I feel this way and you feel that way, and I can't talk to you anymore. And so we're really talking about is systems of learning, not really objects of belief. And that's why a lot of the outcomes, even in the 21st century, aren't that different from outcomes in the 3rd century or the 4th century, because people aren't building conversation around having layers and layers and layers that you have to bring to the table.
Okay. At this point, I'm going to bring in Dr. Kramer Sanders. She had her hand up for a bit. Go ahead, Dr. Sanders, with your comment or your question. Your mic is on mute. Your mic is on mute, Dr. Sanders. Your mic is on mute. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. Oh, I unmuted myself, sorry. And I said, I've been speaking about this for some time, and I've given a lot of reflection to these questions because of religion, of spirituality, because of how foundational it is to our society. If we look at Western civilization, we see the extent to which Western civilization has drawn on Christianity for the basis of its laws, of its morality, of its norms. It is foundational. And there's been a certain interpretation of scriptures and a certain orientation to biblical texts. I have always taken this position that is a form of radical liberation theology, which emphasizes the mystery of God. If you're going to argue that there is God, there's mystery. God has never spoken. In the literal sense. So what we have are individuals who position themselves as authorities, who claim to know God, and all religions make these claims. And we don't affirm this mystery, this unknown, that we only know so much, and that for all of civilization, there has been this attempt to understand. So when Matthew talks about the mystery, conscience, knowing, this is the process. I think that the only way to overcome this impasse where you have a category of people that believe they are in touch with absolute truth, and relativism is to affirm this mystery in the strong sense of the term, and to move away from an authoritative, authoritarian, and absolutist perspective on truth, whether it pertains to biblical scriptures or any religious doctrine, because religious doctrine has historically been deployed and weaponized in a way that oppresses vast categories of people, especially women and LGBT. And so, to me, that is the only path that one can take that can transcend this impasse between those who want openness, that want a more relativist approach to doctrine, and the absolutists. I mean, there has to be an internal dialogue and struggle within the church and within religion as a whole to get back to this question of the mystery of God or the transcendent. And without that, I think you collapse into absolutism and dogma and oppressive ideologies, religious ideologies. And I'd like some feedback from the panelists on this question, because I don't see that happening. I don't see the most radical approach that can really create a path that goes beyond where we are at. Because I don't think simply having a conversation where you're talking to someone who believes they're talking from a standpoint of absolute truth, how can you have a dialogue if you're coming from that place? And what is the ground of that position? The ground of that position is those who read scriptures and interpret it in a particular way, regardless of what denomination it is, and that becomes the absolute truth. We have to turn away from that and emphasize the mystery of God, that God hasn't written literally biblical scriptures. They're written by fallible men who have conscience, and conscience is changed. If we don't get to that point where you can have that kind of conversation about religious doctrine, and I don't care what religion it is, then I think we're going to continue to be embattled.
If I can,
Go ahead.
Now,
Okay, well,
that-
as Dr. Sanders, thank you for your commentary. As it pertains to the whole aspect of how do I think we move forward, I can tell you from my personal experience several things. Number one, and preachers, forgive me for saying this, absolute truth is communicated on Sunday morning to the pulpit, but behind the scenes, any senior leaders or church leaders who preach, who are involved with each other, will tell you that by and large, behind the scenes, there are a lot of conversations, because you cannot be somebody who actually, number one, say a respect for scripture, for the Bible, and not have questions about a lot of the things that are said within the context of this book, as well as your interpretation of it. And so I can tell you behind the scenes, this is not a new conversation. But herein is the problem. The issue is that in general, church culture, as Pastor Matthew talked about the wineskins, church culture tends not to allow even leaders or whatever to have any type of discussion that would challenge the status quo within the larger society. The church is not able to be like Jesus, because what tends to happen is that the way it is set up does not facilitate that. Because I can tell you how many times, even Mr. Wesley can probably share this, how many leaders who, if they ever question the present perspective that the congregation may hold, or that the culture may hold as it pertains to issues of sexuality and gender and whatnot, that the entire framework of their organization collapses. That finances are that finances are done away with, that influence is done away with, that open doors are closed. I can speak from personal experience. When it is that you start talking about this type of stuff, you will find out that by and large, people will tend to run to the hills, because of the fact remains that their foundation, Jesus talked about building upon the rock, which is truth. A lot of these communities, unfortunately, are built upon grains of truth. It's built upon the sand, and it does not have sustainable power. And so if it is that you're going to lose your congregation, if it is that they find out that you're same gender loving, if it is that you're going to lose your congregation, I know a major, she was formerly, before she transitioned, she went through gender reassignment. I can't remember her name, so please forgive me. She was a major voice in the Baptist denomination. When it is that she said that that her gender assignment and that her gender identity were in contradiction, I promise you, she lost everything, and she had to build from the ground up. And so the real repercussions are there. But behind the scenes, I spend a whole lot of time talking to church leaders across generations about these issues and about these topics. The problem is that not many are necessarily willing to pay the cost, or even capable of paying the cost at any type of level, to help to facilitate the type of justice that is needed, and to be fair towards those who are amongst us, because it costs too much. It costs too much for them, and unfortunately, the truth and liberty is not something that many people necessarily may be given towards. It's more so conformity and comfort. And like I said, you find out that many people, especially when their minds are liberated, especially if they're older, that they're just saying, okay, this may be the truth, but I'm comfortable here. I've built this. I have my retirement, have my plans. They have all of these things that's set up in this particular structure. So they're not going to risk that necessarily for liberty or freedom. Because if you set up community in Egypt, what you find to be the proverbial Egypt, why is that you're going to turn turn and want to go towards the Canaan land. And so usually what occurs is that a different generation emerges, and they show up with the same type of core convictions that may be consistent with Jesus the Christ, as well as certain things that may be aligned with the former generation. But they tend to be more progressive and create a different model that allows others a greater sense of freedom. And so what I've learned to do is not necessarily waste my time investing into leaders and trying to get them to change how they think, because even if their minds are changed, the truth remains that their communities are set how it is. And they are and sometimes, to be quite honest, imprisoned and trying to navigate an entire structure and community of people who, if it is that they don't, even if they start to navigate those waters, that in of itself is tempestuous. So you find out that a different church just begins to emerge. And different churches begins to emerge. That's what's always had a tendency to happen. Unfortunately, that's how sometimes we call church splits. Or however, a different church begins to emerge with a more progressive perspective and understanding and liberated mentality that is able to better relate to the society in which it is that they live, and that can empower and enable others to find freedom and know who it is that they are in Christ without having to subject themselves to what for them has now become oppressive.
And if I can connect to that, I know I'm sorry, I know I know there are other questions that connecting to your point, Elexio, and Dr. Saunders, thank you. I fell out of my chair several times. You didn't see it right here, but that was me like yes. And the reason why I'm saying that is because connecting back to the idea or the practice of the politics of respectability, which then creates a culture of conservatism, which then creates this oppressive structure. So now what was deemed to be used as a method to combat racist stereotypes and everything else, now there's this framework of, because our culture is so conservative and because we make the choice not to have the conversations, then if we do try to, going back to Pastor Matt's point about being a heretic, right? But having these conversations are necessary. This is what prophets did. There is a speaking of truth to power. So if we are supposed to be, as you talk about how do these things shift, it really takes the prophets who are willing to speak truth to the powers that be and help them understand that we are living in a very different time. We are living in a time where we are not going to continue to allow the politics of respectability nor conservatism to silence and kill us anymore, because we value ourselves more than that, and mostly because we know God values us more than that. So we're not going to let our oppressors kill us anymore. And if they try, we're going to go down with the fight. It's not just as simple because one has said so, then we just, subscribe to it, become subjected to it, and then kind of move forward. So kind of connected to the points of churches building and kind of branching off, the Vision Cathedral of Atlanta, Bishop O.C. Allen is a product of that. Bishop Yvette Flunder is a product of that. Bishop Carlton Pearson is a product of that. Seeing something different and not wanting to live in the old wineskins. Now, the challenge is, though, when individuals want to remain in their old wineskin, even though a new wineskin has presented itself. This happens a lot, even in seminary respectability. And so when I went to Emory, quick story, the institution, while it is very Christ-centric, there were classes and other ways that we could engage in conversation. However, what was troubling to me was to see other theologians, budding theologians who were going into parish ministry say, oh, well, we're not having conversations about sex and sexuality and gender because this is what I believe. Okay, so if this is the old wineskin of what one believes, but you've come to a place where you're supposed to get this new wineskin, but then taking out what one wants to fit this old frame and not being molded into the posture of what one should become, right? In this consciousness, in this growth. And then you have people who graduate and they still think and practice the same way they did prior to going into these institutions of higher learning. There is an accountability factor. So I want to come back to that. And that's, I guess, where I'll end in that respect. We have to hold individuals accountable when they make the decision not to shift in that respect. We can't force them to, but if we remain silent, that authoritarian power continues to diminish our voices and continues to silence us. It continues to push us off to the margins, and it continues in a land where we're screaming Black Lives Matter, but the lives of Black queer people don't matter. Because the same way that George Floyd and others were murdered, Iyanla, who was a woman of trans experience, was brutally beaten. Video went viral. There was no hashtag for her. But it takes people lifting the voice and saying Iyanla's name in connection with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, because Iyanla matters just as much as George Floyd and Breonna Taylor does, even though she is a woman of trans experience. That separation, that designation of whose lives matter more based on this kind of hierarchical structure of gender, race, class, and sexuality, we have to be able to speak about these social constructs and really deconstruct them in order to build community. But unless we have the really hard conversations, the challenging conversations, to cause one to read a little bit deeper. It's not just about what the Holy Writ says, depending on how one defines something as being holy. That's a whole nother conversation for another day. But it takes reading more than that to get a greater understanding. How do we get fresh revelation if we're reading the same thing over and over again? That does not help us. It doesn't help our consciousness in that respect. So I know I shared a lot, but that, and I'm more of an activist. So that's kind of where all of this is coming out of as it relates to me. And I make no apologies for that. But I do believe that there is a remnant of people who have to really use their voices and be these political prophets and really speak truth to power about the injustices of the land in order for there to be a paradigm shift. Because the shift can occur. It just takes people, going back to Alexio's point, who are willing to pay the price of freedom. And even if we look at Jesus, I'm really going to stop there. Jesus died because of Jesus's truth, not because of Jesus's lie. It's the question of, are we willing to live in that respect and speak the truth to the powers and break the word curses and the projections of how people say that we should live and should be, but truly live in the fullness of who and how the divine has called us to be once we come into awareness of it, because we are responsible for what we know. And if we know better and still choose to do wrong, there's bloodshed in that respect. And that's so dangerous.
Yes. I think a lot of points were made, and I thought about the word reckoning. So dealing with or coming to grips with this kind of consciousness that we've been describing, right? And one of the things that I in my personal kind of walk, as I was listening to Pastor Matthew talk about heretic, that's a word that's been used to describe me about from 5 different churches, right?
Yeah,
that I've been
I
kicked
can
out
attest
of.
to that.
That I've been kicked out of.
Yep.
5 churches. And my dad has a running joke you go to this church and they can kick you out, because whenever you stand up, and watch this, it wasn't even about gender, just challenging them on their theology and the baseless grounds on which they execute theology, right? They cannot take that, right? So imagine bringing this topic up. Listen, you're not going to get it in the Bahamas, right? And I think that Dr. Sanders brings an excellent point. Like, what is it going to take for us to move beyond this place? And one of the things that I decided to do, because Jonathan started to talk about it, what I decided to do was challenge every construct that I had, I guess, attributed to God. And I started to deal with this idea of, is God really a mystery? Right? And then I said, okay, well, if he's love, if he's this, if he's that, then he can't be a mystery. Certainly there has to be a way to know him, right? And then I started to think about, okay, well, I read all of these persons. I read C.S. Lewis, and the way that he used his theology to interrogate the theology of others, and there has to be a way to move the conversation forward and provide a space for freedom for LGBTQ people to exist within the church. One of the things that I find is very disheartening is that what sometimes even really it's a soft spot for me is that when you see persons who are LGBTQ upholding the very same structures that continue to marginalize them. And it's like they're willing to kill a part of themselves just so that they can maintain their ranks. And I'm like, what are you doing? What are you doing? We know pastors in the Bahamas who present as straight, but they are definitely queer. We know that. We know praise and worship leaders. We know that. We know that they exist, right? But they will fall on the sword. They will kill themselves. They will kill that piece of them just so that they can have this quote unquote respect, this dignity, this honor, this kind of prestige and value, as Jonathan was talking about, right? Because it's all about value. It's about power dynamics. It's about these things. Because as Dr. Sanders was saying, if you're speaking from this absolutist kind of perspective, that's a power dynamic. Because if I'm hearing from God, then that means that I'm on the level that you're not at yet. And it means then that you need to listen. It means that you need to know your place, as I've been told so often. God ain't speaking to you. Not now. He ain't called you yet. No. It's not your time. Wait. And that's the issue. The issue is that amongst all of these things, this conservative kind of environment, you're being told it's not your time. You ain't hearing from God. You need to wait. And when you try to push the needle forward and move the church into this place, because I really think that the church, in a lot of ways, when you see it historically, it can be a place of freedom, an expression for freedom to happen. But in the Bahamas in particular, I don't know what happened after 1973, or in conjunction with our movement, our struggle for independence. It seems like everything else within this country, including the church, stopped functioning. And so that's a huge problem, because what you have is a group of people who are dying, who are committing suicide because they don't have access, not just to the church, but to fundamental human rights. And so I think that that's a great place to go, to take us into what would it look like, a space being provided for LGBTQ people to exist within the church. And I think that Pastor Matthew actually can talk to this, right? Because and Jonathan, because Pastor Matthew has shared that several of his parishioners, and in fact, I can say that some people have told me, okay, Natino, you should go to NPCC because it's queer friendly, right? And that's a kind of in Bahamian society, that's been a knock against your church. So I guess Pastor Matthew, you can talk about what you've been doing in that regard, right? And then Jonathan, you could jump in about how your church has been set up and how that has been functioning in Atlanta.
Well, like I mentioned earlier, and by the way, Dr. Saunders, your question is still haunting me. So thank you so much for throwing that down. These are very important conversations. You know, I think people sometimes underestimate how long it takes for something good to happen. You know, and it's taken us close to 30 years to build this kind of community in the Bahamas. These are not things that happen very quickly. You know, we've lost, I never sat down and counted it, but we probably lost, I don't know, close to 15 or more congregations in 30 years, just for choosing to have dialogue about diversity, to push past, you know, the conversation at a superficial level. And it's something that you have to be willing to do, because you will lose friends along the way. You will lose a lot of acquaintances, you know, but what we ultimately were trying to do was to create an environment where the important questions could be raised. You're not going to get answers that you want right away because you're surrounded by people who may not have grown up the way that you did. And we're not talking just about sexuality. We're just talking about they grew up in a different family, or they grew up in a different neighborhood, or, you know, I heard the Department of Statistics say the other day that 8 out of 10 babies born in New Providence have never met their fathers or don't have meaningful relationships with their fathers. I'm trying to build a community around people who have, you know, the orphan spirit. I mean, the starting point, it feels like that game we used to play when we were kids, you know, red light, green light, 1, 2, 3, where you run ahead and then somebody sees you. So you fall back 7 feet or 10 feet and you try to run ahead again. And so progress is always this back and forth, you know, like ever trying to make some headway, and then you feel like you're set back. And You lose people along the way as you go. And so it's not for the light of heart. You know, you have to be willing to be in a community with people. And this may sound contradictory, but the greatest success that we've ever had is being in a community where not everyone agrees on everything. You know, where you don't leave just because someone's, you know, approaching it from a different point of view. And the people that have stayed with us over 30 years had to build a new type of muscle because we were testing these ideas. We were having these uncomfortable conversations. For years, one of the most painful conversations we had in our community was around race. And we knew that we couldn't have this sexuality conversation unless we had the race conversation, unless we had the post-colonial conversation, unless we acknowledge that, you know what, yes, I'll say hi to you, but I don't really want you marrying my daughter because you're not white, or you're not black enough, you know, or you're not PLP enough, or you're not F&M enough. We had to push past party politics in this community for 30 years, and that was very painful. What we got out of it is we have people from every major political persuasion 30 years later sitting in the room who were willing to push past all the discomfort to actually finally say, you know what, would you just like to build a relationship with me? Can we spend time together this year? And we had, you know, sometimes if you make the conversation or the idea too important, you lose the trust that you have to build with the person who embodies that lifestyle. And so we had to put our relationships way out front. People who are not with us 30 years later, sometimes they push an agenda so much you don't get to fall in love with the person, you know. And that's why I say it's not for the light of heart. And I think sometimes the reason these sounds like idealistic conversations, as I hear Dr. Saunders challenge us on what is it going to take, for us it cost us everything. You know, for 30 years people have talked about us negatively as a church. Now that doesn't bother us, because what we got out of it is we have friends that we've walked with and shared life with and we've cried with, and whenever they've lost a child, we go to their house, or whenever they go through a painful divorce, we put our arms around them. Or whenever, you know, they feel like the bottom is falling out, we're like, I'm coming over to your house. What do you need today? How do we get through this moment? And we've had to build our lives around authenticity. Like Elexio said, it's not that you're not talking about truth. It's just that sometimes the most valuable truth that's also absolute, that must be protected, you have to hold that up at a cost. You know, we hold up the banner of, like what John said, you know, earlier in our conversation, we're holding up the banner of the absolute truth that everyone's made in the image of God. That's a very expensive belief these days to hold on to. Because if everyone's made in the image of God, then they have value, you know, and the value gives them identity, you know. And so we took the last 3 decades to say, you don't have to believe all the right things to belong to us. We're going to make belonging how you get into this community. If you just want to belong, come and belong. Belief may take years where we actually try to wrestle with our differences. We're not going to even change your behavior. Just come and belong to a group of people. You know, we lovingly call ourselves the pot cake church because there's all kind of pot cakes here. You know, John, you know the Bahamian thing of pot cake. That's what you guys call the Heinz 57 dog. You know, there's like every kind of breed is in that breed in that dog. You know, and that's what Bahamians are. You know, we're pot cakes. We come from many different cultures and backgrounds and creeds and religions and races, but we're stronger for it. Our immune systems are stronger. Pot cakes don't get sick that easily. You know, pot cakes are resilient. And we have this group that we know 30 years later, we still don't believe the same thing. You know, the person I just buried a few weeks ago, I just buried one of my good friends. He was a Buddhist he was a Buddhist Jewish friend of mine that worshiped with us for close to 10 years. You know, and having someone like him in my life where we would always go to Starbucks and have conversations, and it's taken us years to get to know each other. And so the best things take time. If you really want to create a community where it's not about political correctness or respectability, you have to say, well, I'm going to have to spend a lot of time falling in love with you. I'm going to have to, you know, the Bible says you're going to have to make that person your neighbor. That's your neighbor. And they're not your neighbor because you agree on everything. They're your neighbor because you want to learn from each other. And I think that the most beautiful communities around the world are those who are different, but learning to like each other, learning to love each other. And it's impossible. There's 7.8 billion people on the planet, but even though we only have 16 personalities, the math is exponential. I've spent 30 years doing marriage counseling for people who they never marry the person they were looking for. They're happily incompatible. They're happily incompatible. They marry who they marry. You come from a different family. I come from this family. You have this personality. I have that personality. You have this belief system. I have that belief system. And so you build your relationships around, what is it like for us to coexist, even if we'll never be fully alike? The Black Lives Matter at the end of the day in history won't have resiliency just because someone said it's wrong. Just like the Me Too movement, it's going to matter more in the long term if the people who said, well, I don't agree with you and I don't like the way you talk about my group, they're going to have to push past the activism stage and say, listen, I have to be in your life. You have to be in my life. This is going to take time. This is going to take proximity and intentionality. And I'm going to stay with you long enough to say, listen, can I be sincerely present in your story, even the parts of it I do not understand? And Jesus says, if you try to throw your beautiful belief on someone and they don't know it's beautiful and they don't know if it has value, he says that's throwing pearls before pigs. He's not saying they're not worth it. He's just saying they don't know how beautiful the pearl is. And it doesn't matter how much you believe or what you believe. If the person you're sharing life with doesn't know it has value or if it's any beauty to them, they're not ready to hear it. Just like a pig would, the fact that a pig tramples the pearls into the dirt doesn't mean the pearl isn't beautiful. It just means the pig doesn't know it's beautiful. And that could take years for us to hear each other's stories and to understand each other's stories because we haven't lived it. In Africa, they've got this concept of Ubuntu. And I love this concept of Ubuntu because it means I cannot understand my story without understanding your story. Like the way you braid a rope together, there's not one strand, there's multiple strands. Can you tell me your story? And we won't be able to rewrite the narrative if we don't learn how all the different pieces of the narrative have to come together. And so, Dr. Saunders, it's something that's taken us 30 years and we're not fully there yet. But I can tell you this, we have a lot of friends in our church. We're friends, we're neighbors. You can call me at 3:00 in the morning if something is in your life. My last gay friend called me when his lover died, and he cried so much on my shoulder that all of his sinus came loose. And when I left his house, my shirt was full of mucus. But the one thing I would not do is leave his house until he asked me to. And we cried into the wee hours of the morning because his lover committed suicide on the beach. And his heart was broken. And I went to his house as a friend, and we're friends. We've been friends for 15 years. And he knows that when I'm at his house and when I'm with his friends and we're eating at restaurants together and sharing life together, we're doing the hardest thing possible, which is to build our relationships around, can I be in your life? Can you be in mine? I'm still trying to catch up with your story. You're still trying to catch up with mine, but I'm going to stay with you for the rest of our life, because I have to be with you. You have to be with me, and this is not about agendas. This is not, they say historically, most of the greatest movements of solidarity had two things in common. One was activism, and John is so right about that. It's always the prophets who have to agitate. But they say that none of these movements that started with agitation lasted unless those people became long-term friends. Even the abolition of slavery, the Declaration of Independence, every hard thing that people had to do for their generation, they say the one thing in common, if you look behind the screen of history, is that these people knew each other, they liked each other, they were sharing life together. It wasn't just a bunch of strangers coming together to say, let's fight for this cause. It's interesting that they weren't just agitators, they actually were lifelong friends. And I find that very hopeful because it may not happen on a macro level, but it will happen on a sustainable level. And we have to stay in each other's stories. And that's what we've learned over 30 years.
Okay, I'll let Elexio he wants to make a point. Then we'll get Dr. Sanders, and I'll come to you last, Jonathan, because you guys are actually doing it. So I want you to give us some like for churches that may be looking to model after or choosing to model. You guys have been doing this for quite some time, so you can give us a little bit insight into the programs and the way you've gone about doing that at your church. All right, so go ahead, Elexio.
Okay, to get back to the original question you asked, okay, how do you create spaces, or what do queer people need to do, especially as it pertains to their faith and Christian community? Several things I would say. Number one is, please understand that 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 you should not berate yourself and beat yourself up, be condemned because of the fact that you need to get out of toxic spaces. That there is a time and place and space where it is that you do not need to be involved in these communities in the way that you are, and for your own healing and for your own sense of self, for your own sometimes sanity, that you don't need to be giving yourself into them, not being engaged with them on that level. Because and I appreciate Pastor Matthew's point about pressing into community, but the unfortunate fact is that when, when when the prevailing idea is that who it is that you are is a sin, not what you do, and who it is that you are is dysfunctional. Unfortunately, what tends to happen is that people handle you in that way, and many people are not healthy enough, not mature enough, not whole enough in their own selves, working through their own processes to navigate that type of stuff, because it's traumatic, and it can deeply damage the psyche of people. While it is that you're doing your best to maintain koinonia. And so sometimes it is the best thing to do is just simply be point blank, get the hell out of there. Don't never confuse your relationship with Jesus Christ with church community. Don't put one and make the other the same thing. And so several things that I found, or that I recommend, is that there is the need to for queer people, I think many times to look for the type of help, even if it's not available in a local assembly, to whether it's through virtual means, from other individuals who themselves may be queer individuals, and who can give love and give comfort and help them in their place and space. And then it is that as it is that you're maturing, then you find out that you yourself you have the capacity to give that to other people, that you become a mentor, that you become a support system. I became that to others who were coming to me for help because I went through my own process. And as a result of that, part of my healing and my maturing is that I'm able to give to others the very thing that I myself was not able to find. So you're able to provide, to meet and serve the need of other individuals, as well as I think that it's important that as you talk about people like John Wesley, or maybe even Pastor Matthew, that you're able to draw from other sources and other people and other communities, even not necessarily within the context of your immediate vicinity, but others who can give strength, who can add voice, who can add perspective, who can add comfort, who can be a part of your life, even if it is that they cannot do that physically, that they can add help to you and help in that way. And then as you continue to mature and become whole as a person, whole people are able to bring healing and restoration to others and to create it for other individuals. And so I think that's unfortunately what tends to have to happen within a space and a place like this, because of the prevailing perspectives of many leaders and local assemblies. Because though it is that I would love to believe that, okay, because we disagree, unfortunately, many times the pulpit can still be the place where it is that a posture of disagreement becomes a place of dogma, and is used as a place and space where we berate those who do not necessarily think how it is that we think. And NPCC, I can say, and I appreciate that that has not been that type of place and space, but unfortunately, many of our communities are in that way, because that's what it is that we hold church and leaders to. That the foundation of our communities is not relationship, is not community, it's doctrine. It's a particular idea, it's a particular philosophy, and that we gather around this. Many Christians are more so Biblians. They don't gather around the person of Jesus Christ and his heart. They gather around 66 books and however it is that they want to interpret that, or whatever it allows for them to do. So there has to be that type of transition. And when it is that you find that that's the type of place that your space is dealing with, that they're gathering more so around a book on a particular doctrinal perspective, that's what they call denominations. Denominationalism, it's around, I think this way. When is it you find those type of places and spaces as you're maturing into a place and space where who it is that you are does not fit within that context? Do not subject yourself to that type of place and space just for the sake of love and for the sake of connection, unless it is that you're mature enough to deal with sometimes the blowback, and to recognize that being courageous doesn't mean sitting down and fighting every battle. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is leave them where it is that they are and move forward for your own self to develop, for your own self to mature. And then guess what? When it is that you're mature enough, the thing that will begin to happen many times is the very same people who berated you and condemned you have all these ideas and beliefs about you. You will find out like Nicodemus, Nick at night, come to Jesus. And they will come to you for answers and solutions. And behind the scenes, you will be the very person able to wash the very feet of the people whose culture would condemn you. But because you're mature enough and you're loving enough and you're holy enough to do that, to serve them in their ignorance and their ineptitude and their prejudice or whatever, to say, you know what, I'm mature enough and I'm well enough to accept you where it is that you are and still not be subjected to your prejudice and your perspectives, and to engage you within the context of what you have the capacity for, because you just simply didn't have the capacity for me. And I think once it is as queer people mature, as queer people continue to heal and mature, and I think that is the best thing, because as far as I'm being concerned, I've been telling my friends this, I have found queer people many times to be a better reflection of the nature of Jesus Christ, by nature of the suffering that they have experienced and the marginalization, to be a better reflection of the person and the agenda of Jesus Christ, unfortunately, as opposed to Christian community, because Jesus has always aligned himself with the oppressed and those that are undermined. And so that is to be Christ-like, is to be in that way, to go against the status quo. And once the church has shown herself to be unwilling to do that, then God has a way of making himself known even through the very people that we ourselves, unfortunately, as Christians, would seek to condemn and call antichrist, when in fact remains that we are less of a reflection of him than the very people that we would berate and condemn.
Go ahead, Dr. Sanders.
Yeah, I wanted to take up this question or this comment by, I think it's Pastor Matthew Sweeting. And it has to do with this metaphor of throwing pearls at pigs, or this idea of a hierarchy. I really think that I see that as a form of paternalism. Mm-hmm. I think that the challenge to be transformative is to have the courage to find a path of inclusiveness, however it is framed, that allows for the foregrounding of the idea that we are all in the image of God. If that is a fundamental tenet of belief, then there must be a way of constructing that narrative, constructing that concept such that it is liberatory, and to have the courage to do it. Now, I understand the politics, the institutionalism, the political and financial issues that are at stake. But I believe there has to be a vision and a commitment and a courage in this place, the Bahamas, to do that, which requires taking on oppression and recognizing it and affirming it in the name of Christ. Why can't that be done? And why can't that be powerful and transformative, rather than presuming that somehow the masses aren't ready? that there needs to be this hierarchy. No, we've got to think more boldly and more transformatively than we have. It's possible. It doesn't take a lot. If there, I think, was one major church in this country that took a different position, that would be transformative, and boldly so, not something that is said quietly in corners. I think in our context, that to me would be transformative. Huh? And that's all I wanted to say.
Okay.
Hi, I'd like to say something.
Just give me a second, Alexis. Kivante wanted to say something because I'm coming to you, Jonathan. Then I'll let Alexis say something, and then we'll get to Jonathan so that he can give us a little model of what they're doing in Atlanta. So go ahead, Kivante, then Alexis, and then we'll hear from Jonathan.
Can you hear me perfectly? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone on the panel, for coming out and engaging in this dialogue. It's been very interesting and honestly revolutionary for the country. And yeah, thank you, Dr. Sanders, for setting up the framework with all of those like necessary and relevant questions for those who are, I guess, like a-religious or just have their questions in regards to religion and the queer community. And I guess like I just wanted to latch on to what Dr. Sanders said, as well as kind of like touch on what Pastor Matthew and Elexio would have talked about in terms of just like sin versus sinner, or this relational kind of like structure that we're like rallying for the church to kind of like set up to bring community or to bring the queer community and the church together as one. And I guess my question is really in regards to just like dissonance with the church, and particularly with people who are Christians who also identify as queer. I'm not necessarily following just like when we consider the colonial history of us being Caribbean people, Black people, and we just consider just like the context of everything that Dr. Sanders again would have set up for us. I'm not following how is it that we can sort of like disengage ourselves from the philosophy of Christianity particularly. And I have to again like pinpoint on Christianity because one, it's the one that I know very in-depthly, and it's the one that we cling to as Bahamian people. Why is it that, you know, we disengage from the philosophy of Christianity to now say that this absolute God or this God of mystery or whoever God is for people who believe in God, how is it that God can love us in spite of or despite, you know, like in spite of our queerness? I'm not necessarily following, and I would like particularly Elexio and Pastor Matthew to speak on it, because again, like Pastor Matthew said something in regards to just like getting to know the person in order to have relationship, but I'm not sure if when he said that if he meant that getting to know the person and then overlooking the queerness, because yeah, it doesn't.
Can you restate the question one more time, just so we can understand?
No problem. Yeah, no problem. My question is in regard to sort of like, dissonance. How is it that the church is able to sort of disengage from the ideologies of Christianity in order to say, like, let's have a relationship with queer people, overlook their queerness and not affirm it, or not say that this is a beautiful thing and that this is okay?
Okay, well, I'll jump in here. I would have to say, Kivante, that and this is for me one of my frustrations and pet peeves when it comes to the Christian community, as diverse as she is the fact that we tend not to have, number one, a good grip on history when it comes to the church. Number two, we tend to be disconnected from an understanding of psychology, human physiology, as well as when we take biblical texts, we tend to We tend to understand it within a vacuum and not within the context of what was occurring there and then. And so we live something that's 2,000 plus years removed, and then it is that we present that within our present space, and we hold to that as the standard and the declaration of who it is that we are. And based upon what is presented at first glance in Scripture, there is no place and space for anybody who is LGBTQ IA being a follower of Jesus Christ. In fact, I think it is First Corinthians makes very clear, said that based upon how it is that they translated the scriptures, which was horrible, they it says that those that adulterous, fornicators, homosexual, or some translations effeminate, whatever, cannot inherit the kingdom of God. So if it is that say that you are a follower of Jesus Christ, then it is a complete contradiction to say that you follow him, and that a part of who it is that you are is something that at first glance, the book that we tend to believe that he wrote in some way or another is in fact that what is inside it is a declaration of yourself. It's in contradiction, and so that's part of the issue of cognitive bias, that there's such a disconnect, as well as the truth remains that many, and I'm not trying to berate leaders, but the truth is many church leaders personally don't ever deal with the reality of who it is that they are personally, and so they cannot create culture and climates within their communities to facilitate something along those lines. They cannot do it, and so that's why it is that we end up with some ideas. They say that you have a struggle, or we made being queer some type of demonic spirit, and this is the one that I learned in my early 20s. And you're not gay because typically the issue is really homosexuality. I mean, the fact remains that we really don't. Truth, a lot of churches don't have an issue really, and when it comes to lesbians, the whole aspect of transgender or intersection, anything else, it's really just two men that just kills a lot of Christians in their thinking. And so I lost my point. And so the fact remains that because the cognitive dissonance is existing simply because we never reconciled within our own selves who it is that we are. And we can't reconcile that within our own selves who it is they are. Therefore, we can't facilitate in our communities. We cannot facilitate it within our places and spaces. And so you come into a place and to a local assembly expecting to be liberated, when the truth be told that I cannot facilitate your liberty as a preacher or as a community if I myself am still bound. And the place of bondage, unfortunately, is held to consider to be freedom. And so we say, you're not homosexual, you have same-sex attractions, or you're in a gay lifestyle, whatever the lifestyle is. And no one has ever been able to bring definitions or clarity to a lot of this stuff. And so I think it's the personal disconnection. If you can disconnect it from yourself, or disconnect from the part of who it is that you are, then it is that you can present a more quote unquote noble perspective and presentation to your audience so that you can be accepted and you don't rock the boat and that it goes easier for you within the community that you're in. Hope that helps, Kavante.
Yeah, it does. Thank you for your honesty.
Okay, Dr. Matthew, you wanted to say something, or you good? Sorry.
First of all, I would like to say that's a fantastic question. It's also a very hard question, which means we need to talk about it. I heard everything that Elexio just said, and what I want to say now, I don't want to say it in a way that negates what he says. I just want to talk about how we've kind of tried to manage it in our own community. The reason I think it's such a good question is I think that's probably why there's so much confusion, in the world today around how do you actually talk about these things, and so Kavante, did I just pronounce your name properly? Kavante?
Kavante.
Okay, thank you. We don't go to that point that Elexio was referencing, where we try to force people to somehow categorize where they're at, where they're, in other words, to say, if they say to us, I'm queer, we don't try to convince them that they're otherwise. And the reason we don't do that and have never done that historically, or whether they say I'm lesbian, or transgender, is we believe that because that's a matter of identity, that's something they're going to have to work out between themselves and their maker. And we believe that fundamentally, people throughout history, not only in the church, but people throughout the community, have not done a very good job trying to have conversations around identity where they can actually protect or sometimes respect or sometimes give their friends or acquaintances proximity to the conversation or to their lives. So when someone comes to us in our community and says, well, this is how I see myself, that's always pushed us to another conversation, which is equally as complex. And the conversation is this: is a person's identity irreconcilable to their relationship with God? And that's what I meant earlier when I said that you can't really have a sexuality conversation unless you're having an identity conversation, or you can't have a race conversation unless you can have an identity conversation. At the end of the day, people who speak in very hateful ways, or some people who don't know what to say at all, or whoever has their views and shares them or don't share them, I think at the end of the day, that's really what people are struggling with. If someone feels so strongly about their identity, does that push them out of the conversation as far as God is concerned? And we would say no, never, and never will happen. We feel that God is inviting people to approach him in sincerity with their questions, whether those questions are unresolved or whether they're still looking for answers or whether they feel they have the answer. And now that's a very dangerous way to do community, because then the front door is open so wide. You let in all the Democrats, all the Republicans, all the PLPs, all the FNMs, all the black, red, white, beige people. Everyone comes through the door, because if the common denominator, and this is what I think Dr. Saunders is challenging us about, is, how do you actually do this? What is the starting point? Or does it have to be a hierarchical issue? I do not think it has to be hierarchical. I think it takes a lot more faith to believe that each of us can bring our different identities to the table and still try to approach God at the same time. So a lot of times in Bahamian culture, to give you an example that we hear all the time, I always hate in our country when people say, well, are you an outside child? Because so many Bahamians come from families where it's never the same dad or the same mom. And I've never been very comfortable as a Bahamian where people say, well, that's my outside brother or that's my outside sister. Because I think a lot of us come from families where our families were formed in those ways and under those circumstances. And I don't always like the word outside. I think when we say you're a child of God, you're a child of God. You're not an inside child of God or an outside child of God, just because your identity is framed up in these ways. And I think it's been very unhelpful and very harmful and very combative. And as Dr. Saunders would suggest, very hierarchical. And I would even say very institutional and very binary, when the conversation always stops around, well, your identity is not really my identity. Because if that's the starting point, we'll always loop right back around to where we started. We said, well, I don't want to deal with you because you're not heterosexual enough for me, or you're not Baptist enough for me, or you're not PLP, or, you don't vote for Trump or whatever. You don't get the Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement. It's much more hard and much more difficult. And this is, people sometimes say, well, what is NPCC? And I say, well, we are a 30-year-old social experiment in the Bahamas of how to bring people together. And when you just allow people to come with their questions or even their beliefs, and you believe that God at the end of the day is going to allow each person to look for him or to be curious or to go along the path, and you make that a starting point, then that takes a lot more faith. And so, that's why at the end of the day, spirituality is a risky business. If you want to have the conversation at this level, you have to be willing for it to be, messy. So we say to people, we are diverse by design. We choose to let people come as they are. That's not a criteria that you have to kind of negotiate your way through in our community. If you think of yourself this way, as a pastor, I'm not going to sit down with you and have the conversation about whether you're queer or not queer, gay or not gay, Baptist or Buddhist or Presbyterian. The hardest conversation I find for human beings, and this is something that psychologists talk about. They said, you know, all of our choices come down to two primal emotions every day. What you don't love, you fear. And what you lose fear of, you learn to love. You know, and that's hard for people. And religion, that's where religion needs a facelift, where you have to say, look, the one thing that binds us all together is, and this is what Jesus talked about, you know, can my love cast out your fear? You know, can you not be afraid of other people? Can you not be afraid of yourself? Can you not be afraid of the questions that you have? Can you not be afraid of talking about multiple identities? Because that's always been the struggle of humanity. You know, in the first century, when the church was finding its origins, people who had Jewish backgrounds were very uncomfortable. The people who were not Jewish were joining this new religion. And the most dangerous thing that Jesus did is include everybody. And so here we are, you know, in the 21st century, and we're still trying to protect what he died for, which is that everybody gets to come to the table. Now you'll always get a knife on your back for thinking that way, you know, where the last can be first, because some people need to believe that there's a first person and there's a last person, or there's a first religion and there's a last religion, or there's a first sexuality or a last sexuality. When Jesus says, no, the people that you thought were in the back of the line, I'm moving them to the front of the line. That's a dangerous religion, because you have to take love very seriously, and everyone will talk bad about you, and you won't have a lot of friends, and you won't have a lot of churches that will do work with you, but you have to protect the great conversation, which is that everyone belongs, you know, and that's what we fight for. That's an absolute truth we will not let go of, is you have to love your neighbors, whether you may not fully understand them, because what if you've only grown up, just like a person who's gay says, I only feel gay. That's how heterosexuals feel about themselves. They say, well, I only feel heterosexual, you know, but if you can teach them, well, you don't have to choose that for them. You can invite them to the table just like you're coming to the table, you know, and that's why we don't really draw the lines along those ways. So Kavanti, let me know if you think I've answered your question, or if that raises another question.
No, that answers my question perfectly. Thank you for your honesty. I appreciate it very much.
Okay, so we're winding down. We'll have Alexis question, and then Jonathan will give us a little bit insight. So in the essence of time, we got about 10 minutes. Let's try to be as brief as possible, because we have another session to get to. But Alexis, you can go ahead, and then Jonathan, you can end us with what you're doing in Atlanta.
It's more of a comment than a question. And I would like to thank personally the panelist that was chosen to talk today, because it brought a lot of clarity and understanding, especially to me being a spiritual person, and also to many of my persons listening to this live on Facebook and on Zoom. I just want to say that having this conversation meant so much, knowing that there are spaces and there are places for individuals like myself that can come and worship in any which way they feel, or worship who they feel they should be worshiping. Not knowing that there were affirming spaces was our issue. So I think for us now moving forward is sharing this message to our community members and letting them know there are spaces where they can affirm their faith. It doesn't have to be Christianity. It doesn't have to be whatever they subscribe to, but there's a place where you can listen and you can learn and how you can grow spiritually. And I think that's what was missing in our country. The true places that we can go without judgment, without fear, without being pointed at, without church members looking at you and ridiculing you. That's what our community was looking for, a safe space place in order to be able to worship whom and whatever they believe in. And I always tell people, your spirituality is a personal journey. It is not something that happens overnight. It's not something that you have to follow doctrines and all these other things. But if you subscribe to a type of religion and their doctrine says XYZ, that's where I think of the conflict comes in to what you subscribe. I always tell people the church is an NGO. The church is a non-governmental organization. They too have a part to play in the building of society. But when it comes to places of affirming who you are and whose you are, I think as a community, we need to find which are the right spaces for us. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you for that, Alexis, because I actually want to connect, and I know we're short on time. And as I was listening to Elexio and Pastor Matthew, there were just some points I just want to lift them really quick, and then I will go into answering the question. So, I identify more as spiritual than I do identify as Christian because of the evolution of my own theology and my own life experience. But there are just some factors, to consider as we continue to have these conversations, right? I know, as Elexio mentioned earlier, sometimes people view queerness as being a lifestyle or a practice. I sing, I do praise and worship and all that other stuff. I practice singing to become a better singer. I don't practice being queer to be a better queer. Does that make sense? So when we relegate the experiences of people to a practice only, that continues to give people the agency and the authority to demonize us or think of us as being immoral because of the idea that we are just after sex. If I'm just going to be really, really candid about that. And that's not the truth, right? And I'm glad, Pastor Matt, that you shared that you have friends who are queer, things of that nature, because oftentimes the struggle is heterosexual individuals. Some tend to believe that if they get into relationship with a queer person, that the queer person, that we want them sexually, like everybody. Like we, like nobody has a type, like it's just a free for all. And that's just not the case. And that type of ideology, again, prohibits the way we're able to build and connect relationships. What I will say, kind of in connection to the Vision Cathedral of Atlanta, specifically here in Atlanta, Georgia, while the Bahamas, and I'm so grateful to hear you all's stories as a researcher, this is like really great. I kind of want to come and do an ethnographic study in the Bahamas, side note. But even in the American South, and granted, I'm not born and raised in the South, but from being here for 13 years, the same struggles that you all are facing or sharing are the same struggles that are happening here, especially in the American South. Bishop O.C. Allen was the first bishop to open a space that speaks to, we are all of God's children, whosoever, you are welcomed here. So he started this movement along with his husband, Rashad Burgess. They have two beautiful children together, and they have been pastoring Vision Cathedral for a very long time now. But what I want to share in reference to that is there are people who will come to the Vision Church. They are part of mainstream reformations and denominations, but they, won't participate. They won't join because where they are, it's kind of where they're comfortable. When it's fearful to be a part of something else, be a part of an organization where we are affirmed. When Bishop is preaching or others are preaching, the focus is not solely on our sexuality. It's about the beautiful creation in which God has made all of us, and how do we operate in this world, right? Where we're not chasing the pulpit, but it's really understanding that the earth is our pulpit. That is where we're supposed to be doing the evangelism and the outreach and doing social activism and things of that nature and calling people into community. But what we do not do is try to force individuals into community with us who don't care and do not want us. There are Sunday mornings, we've had protesters on the opposite side of the street during the Sunday morning service, with their hate signs, with their bullhorns. And Bishop Allen would not get irate. He wouldn't go and tell them off. He would say, hey, I love you, and you're welcome to come in and worship with us because God loves you and so do I. So when I look at it from that respect, as Bishop Allen being kind of that example here in the American South, where we're in the Bible Belt. So, everything that's queer is wrong and sinful, people go to hell. That's the framework, that's the dogma that is spewed. But it's been great to have a space here where we can all come and worship God in the fullness of who we are and act out on the call that God has placed on our lives. But as I mentioned earlier, in connection to Bishop Allen, there's also Bishop Yvette Flunder, who's the bishop of the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, TFAM. An amazing woman, brilliant woman. We also have Bishop Keith McQueen, who has a work in Chicago and has churches in various places as the Vision Church does, as TFAM does, have a network of affirming churches here in the United States in different pockets, right? Because even though we are in this country, everybody still is not progressive in that respect. So the Vision Church definitely tries its best to make sure that we are clear about who God has called us to be, and in our training and in our programming, we want those things to be consistent. So people can find the reconciliation of their sexuality and spirituality, but also know that in all of who we are, in our sexualities, in our interconnectedness, that we are still children of God, and we move from vision to victory. And that consists of how we view ourselves, understanding how that we need to view ourselves the same way that God views us, which is in a view of love and wanting what's best for us. And when we want what's best for us, when we learn that and accept that and can walk in community with others who believe and support that as well, it helps us to really be change agents in society. So that's what's happening here. And for future reference, if anybody wants to continue to connect, I can pass these organizational names forward so that you can connect. And there are also other cisgender heterosexual bishops and pastors who are also affirming and inclusive. So if a person is queer, that's where you're getting spiritually fed, like Bishop Freddie Martin, for example. Like there is no you stay over here, or you could just perform in the arts department, the worship and arts department, but can't do anything else, because some churches actually do operate like that, which is unfortunate. But there are so many spaces within the United States that are still budding, and individuals who are still growing in their theology and in their practice to be more inclusive of the queer community.
All right. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I guess you could drop the link down in the box, chat box, for your church and those names as well. I want to thank Elexio Baillou. I want to thank Jonathan Wesley. I want to thank you, Pastor Matthew, for all being here. This has been a great first step in us trying to unpack all of this. We're going to have more conversations, and we are going to call on you guys again. And hopefully we can get some more people to the table. And once we get some more people to the table, we can flesh out even further the way forward and how we can hopefully create more spaces for the LGBTQ people who are people of faith in whatever respect their spirituality or religion may take place. This has been a wonderful talk. The next session that's coming up is going to talk about polyamorous relationships, and our next presenter is standing by. So I'm going to say thank you once again. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you over in the next room in 2 minutes. All right. Thank you again, everyone. Goodbye. Good evening. All right. See you.